Good evening. Tonight, our sleep story is the entire volume of the Shire Chronicles, parts 1 through 5. Let's begin. The village of Greenhill Vale awoke slowly, cradled in the embrace of the rolling foothills to the west of the great river. The sun cast its first warm rays across the thatched roofs and tidy gardens, glinting on windows made of polished glass. Nestled against the base of a small, flower-speckled hill was the home of Orlen Mossroot, a name spoken warmly by his neighbours for his steady hand in gardening and his knack for crafting soothing brews of tea. Orlen's burrow, Mossburrow, was a tidy little place with walls of clay-packed earth and a round door painted a deep green. Inside, the aroma of dried herbs and beeswax candles mingled pleasantly. A gentle snore came from Orlen's bedroom, where the round-faced hobbit-like man had spent most of the night reading an old, tattered book about herbal remedies. His spectacles sat askew on his bedside table, next to a teacup still half full. The first sound to stir Orlen was the faint chiming of windbells he'd hung outside the kitchen window. Their soft, melodic song carried on the morning breeze, mingling with the distant murmur of the creek that ran through the vale. He yawned, stretched his arms, and blinked at the sunlight filtering through the round, green glass of his window. "Morning already," he mumbled to himself, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Best get to it, then." Orlen dressed in his favourite vest, a brown one embroidered with golden stitching that reminded him of autumn leaves, and shuffled into his small kitchen. He lit a fire in the stove and set about preparing breakfast. A loaf of bread toasted on the hearth, a dollop of blackberry jam, and a pot of strong chamomile tea. He ate slowly, savouring the peaceful quiet of the morning, though he couldn't help but feel a faint twinge of unease that he couldn't quite place. After breakfast, Orlen stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the crisp, dewy air. His garden stretched before him like a painter's canvas, rich with colour and life. Rows of sunflowers swayed gently in the breeze, and the vines of his prized honey squash climbed a trellis he'd built last spring. Orlen crouched near a patch of lavender, brushing the soil with his fingers to test its dampness. As he worked, the rustle of the wind in the trees and the hum of bees created a comforting melody that made the world feel far away and safe. He was inspecting a cluster of blueberries, plump and dark as ink, when a soft, uncertain voice broke the stillness. "Master Mossroot?" Orlen turned to see a young woman standing at the edge of his garden. She was thin and pale, with chestnut-brown hair tucked under a simple bonnet. In her hands, she clutched a small bundle wrapped in linen, holding it to her chest as though it might break. Orlen straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "Good morning, Miss Erin," he said warmly, recognizing her as one of the shopkeeper's daughters. "What brings you here so early?" Erin hesitated, her eyes darting to the ground before meeting his. I found something, sir, near the old willow by the creek. It looked odd. I didn't know who else might know what to do with it." She held out the bundle, and Orlen stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. As he unwrapped the cloth, a small stone fell into his hand. It was cool to the touch, darker than a moonless night, with veins of silver running through it like frozen lightning. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, symbols that Orlen didn't recognize, but that stirred something deep in his memory. "It's unlike anything I've seen," Erin said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it might be, well, something dangerous." Orlen studied the stone carefully, turning it over in his fingers. There was a faint hum to it, almost imperceptible, like the vibration of a struck tuning fork. It was as though the stone held some kind of energy, lying dormant but not entirely at rest. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked, his tone more serious now. "Under the willow," she replied. "Near the roots. I almost didn't see it. It was covered in moss, like it had been there for ages." Orlen frowned. The willow by the creek was well known in the Vale, a tree so old that even the elders couldn't remember a time before it. If the stone had been lying there all this time, how had no one noticed it until now? "You did the right thing bringing it here," he said, tucking the stone back into the cloth. "I'll look into it." Erin nodded, relief washing over her face. "Thank you, Master Mossroot. I didn't want to keep it. Something about it feels wrong." As she turned to leave, Orlen watched her go, his thoughts heavy. He was a simple man, more at home with trowels and teapots than mysteries, but the stone felt like something that couldn't be ignored. Orlen carried the stone back into Mossborough, wrapping it carefully in the linen bundle. He set it on his sturdy oak kitchen table, the symbols glinting faintly in the soft light that filtered through his round window. For a long while he simply stared at it, his mind turning over thoughts like a millstone grinding grain. The symbols were unlike any script Orlen had seen in the few books of lore kept in the Vale. They were sharp, angular, and etched so finely it was as though a master craftsman had carved them with a single hair-thin blade. Yet for all their precision, they didn't seem entirely lifeless. As his eyes traced the patterns, he swore he could almost feel the faintest pull toward them, like an unseen thread tugging at the edges of his thoughts. To steady himself, Orlen busied his hands. He lit a beeswax candle, brewed another pot of tea, and reached for his journal, a well-worn book filled with sketches, notes on his garden, and the occasional scribbled rhyme. Sitting at the table, he carefully sketched the symbols from the stone onto a fresh page, his quill scratching softly against the parchment. "It's just a stone," he muttered, as though saying it aloud might make it true. "Probably left behind by one of the old traders passing through years ago. Nothing more." But the explanation felt hollow. Greenhill Vale was far from the old trade routes that once crisscrossed the lands. Travellers came and went, yes, but nothing of significance had passed through the Vale in many years. At least, nothing Orlen could recall. As he stared at the symbols, a fragment of an old tale stirred in his memory. It was something his grandmother used to tell him on winter nights by the fire, when the wind howled and the shadows seemed to grow long. "There are stones older than the hills," she had said, her voice low and full of mystery. "Stones that hold whispers of the world before ours, carried by rivers and buried beneath roots. They remember what we've forgotten." At the time, Orlen had dismissed it as just another fireside story meant to amuse a curious child. But now, with the stone sitting before him, the words felt less like fiction and more like a warning. A sharp knock at the door broke Orlen's concentration. He blinked, realizing the sun had climbed higher in the sky than he'd thought. Wiping his hands on a nearby cloth, he walked to the door and opened it to find Adric Thornbranch standing on his doorstep. Adric was the Vale's unofficial historian, or, as he preferred to call himself, a keeper of tales. He was a wiry man with sharp eyes and a knack for knowing things no one else seemed to remember. His cloak, patched and frayed at the edges, carried the scent of the woods and ink. "Morning, Orlen," Adric said with a grin that didn't quite mask the curiosity in his eyes. I heard from Erin that you've come across something unusual. Orlen raised an eyebrow. She moves fast for someone so shy. She does indeed, Adric replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. And when she mentioned strange symbols, I thought I'd better come see for myself. Orlen hesitated but nodded, leading Adric to the kitchen table. The historian's eyes widened as he saw the stone. He reached out to touch it but stopped just short, his hand hovering above it. By the trees, Adric murmured, his tone uncharacteristically subdued. Where did you say she found this? Under the willow by the creek, Orlen replied, pulling out the chair opposite him. She said it was covered in moss, like it had been there for years. Adric frowned, sitting down and leaning closer to the stone. I've seen marks like these in an old ledger from the far south. They're not dwarvish, nor are they elvish, not entirely anyway. These symbols belong to something older. Orlen felt a chill settle over him. Older? How much older? Adric didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rummaged in his satchel, pulling out a worn notebook. He flipped through its pages until he found what he was looking for. A sketch of similar markings. These, he said, pointing to his notes, were found carved into the roots of an ash tree deep in the barrow wood. They're said to belong to the keepers of the hidden paths, an ancient order long vanished, who were said to protect relics from an age before men or hobbits walked these lands. Orlen stared at the sketch, then at the stone. The symbols weren't identical, but they were close enough to make his stomach churn. Relics? Protecting them from what? Adric leaned back, his expression darkening. From things best left forgotten. The words hung in the air like the weight of a storm cloud. Orlen wanted to laugh, to dismiss it all as one of Adric's many stories meant to amuse and bewilder. But as he looked at the stone, at the faint shimmer of the symbols in the light, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something far beyond his understanding. What should I do with it? Orlen asked finally, his voice quiet. Adric considered this for a long moment before speaking. The keepers left few traces behind. If this stone is what I think it is, it doesn't belong here. It belongs where it cannot be found. Orlen frowned. And where might that be? Adric's gaze shifted to the window, where the old willow stood in the distance, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Perhaps, he said slowly, we should start where it was found. The willow has been here longer than the Vale itself. If it holds answers, it won't give them easily. Orlen nodded, his resolve hardening. Then we'll go to the willow. As the two men prepared to leave Mossburrow, the stone seemed to hum faintly, as though it knew its fate was about to unfold. Orlen and Adric stood at the edge of the old willow's domain, where the grassy fields of the Vale gave way to a shadowed hollow. The tree's gnarled roots stretched out like the limbs of some ancient sleeping creature, half submerged in the soft earth. Its massive trunk, streaked with moss and lichen, leaned slightly toward the creek, as if whispering secrets to the waters that flowed past. Though Orlen had walked this path countless times, the willow felt different now. The air beneath its canopy was heavy, as though the tree itself pressed its presence into the ground and sky alike. The creek's gentle babble seemed muted, replaced by the rustling of leaves that sounded almost deliberate. Odd, isn't it? Adric said, his voice low. How it feels as though we're being watched. Orlen nodded, clutching the cloth-wrapped stone in his hands. It's always been a quiet place. but now it feels expectant. Adric stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth near the roots. He crouched, running his fingers along the grooves in the bark. "Do you see these markings here?" he asked, pointing to faint scratches that wound around the base of the trunk. Orlen peered closer, squinting. The marks were subtle, almost erased by time and weather, but there was a pattern to them, a series of intersecting spirals and lines that seemed to hum faintly in his mind, much like the stone in his pocket. "I never noticed those before," Orlen said. Adric pulled a small vial from his satchel, pouring a thin stream of water over the markings. As the bark darkened, the lines became clearer, forming a symbol that mirrored one of the etchings on the stone. "It's the same," Orlen whispered, the realization sending a chill down his spine. Adric nodded grimly. "Whatever this stone is, it wasn't just lying here by chance. The willow was its keeper, at least for a time." As the two men examined the markings, a low, creaking sound echoed through the hollow. Orlen froze, his hand instinctively tightening around the stone. The willow's branches swayed, though no breeze stirred the air. A soft groan, like the settling of ancient wood, came from beneath them. "Did you hear that?" Orlen asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Adric didn't answer immediately. Instead, he knelt near the largest root, where the soil had begun to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a small opening was forming, a dark hollow beneath the base of the tree, as though the roots themselves were moving aside. "This is no accident," Adric said, his tone both awed and wary. "The tree knows we're here." Orlen hesitated. "Knows? Trees don't know things." Adric gave him a sharp look. "Don't they? The oldest trees, ones like this, they've seen more than we ever will, and some of them remember." The opening widened just enough for a person to crawl through. From within came a faint glow, pale and silvery, like moonlight caught in water. Orlen swallowed hard. "You're not suggesting we go in there, are you?" "You have the stone," Adric said simply, gesturing toward the cloth in Orlen's hand. "And something in there seems to want it back." Orlen hesitated, his mind racing. He had always thought of himself as a practical man, one who believed in good soil and steady work, not in ancient stones or talking trees. But standing here, with the willow creaking above him and the stone humming faintly in his hand, he felt as though he had stepped into one of his grandmother's old tales. Before he could talk himself out of it, he crouched down and peered into the opening. The glow from within wasn't bright, but it pulsed gently, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. "I'll go first," Orlen said, surprising even himself. Adric raised an eyebrow but said nothing, stepping back to let him pass. Orlen tucked the stone securely into his vest pocket and crawled into the hollow, the damp earth cool against his hands. The narrow tunnel twisted downward, the glow growing brighter with each step. The air within the hollow was cool and strangely still, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and something metallic, like the tang of iron after a summer storm. As the tunnel opened into a wider chamber, Orlen found himself kneeling in a space unlike anything he'd imagined. The chamber was small, no taller than twice his height, but its walls shimmered faintly with the same silvery light as the stone. Runes and spirals etched into the walls glowed softly, pulsing in time with the faint hum in his pocket. At the center of the room lay a pedestal of smooth, polished stone, its surface inlaid with patterns that matched those on the walls and the stone he carried. Adric's voice startled him from behind. "I've heard of places like this," he said, his tone reverent. "Hidden sanctuaries, they called them. The keepers used them to guard things of great power or great danger." "Danger?" Orlen echoed, his unease growing. Adric stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the pedestal. Some relics were made to preserve knowledge, others to protect. But a few were meant to contain things that shouldn't be allowed to roam free. Orlen's hand instinctively went to the stone in his pocket. "And this? Which is it?" "That," Adric said, his eyes narrowing, "is what we need to find out." As Orlen approached the pedestal, the hum of the stone grew stronger, vibrating faintly against his chest. It was as though the stone knew this place, recognized it, and was eager to return. He hesitated, his hand hovering over his pocket. "What happens if I put it there?" he asked, glancing at Adric. The historian shook his head. "That depends. Does the stone belong here, or was it meant to be hidden elsewhere?" Orlen frowned, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to be cautious, but the pull of the stone was undeniable. Slowly he withdrew it from his pocket and placed it on the pedestal. The reaction was immediate. The glow of the chamber intensified, the runes flaring brightly as the air filled with a deep, resonant hum. The pedestal began to shift, its surface splitting open to reveal a hollow within. From it rose a second object, a ring of dark, weathered metal inscribed with the same runes as the stone. Adric's eyes widened. "That's no mere trinket," he murmured. Orlen stared at the ring, a deep sense of unease settling over him. The hum in the chamber began to fade, replaced by an eerie stillness. "What have we uncovered?" Orlen whispered. Adric didn't answer. He was already reaching for the ring. The walk back to Mossburrow was quiet, save for the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the gravel path. Orlen kept his gaze low, his thoughts turning over everything they had seen and heard beneath the willow. The stone felt heavier now, its weight a constant reminder of the choice he had made to bring it out into the world. Adric seemed equally lost in thought, his brow furrowed as he occasionally scribbled notes into his battered notebook. Every now and then, he glanced back toward the distant hills, as though expecting something, or someone, to appear. When they reached Mossburrow, the familiar comforts of Orlen's home did little to ease the tension in the air. The kettle sang its cheerful tune on the stove, and the faint scent of lavender drifted through the open windows, but neither man spoke as they settled at the kitchen table. "We need a plan," Orlen said at last, breaking the silence. Adric nodded, setting down his notebook. "Agreed. The first step is to get this ring and stone far away from the Vale. If the stories about the keepers are true, then others may come looking for it, and not all of them will have good intentions." Orlen frowned. "You think someone will come here? To Greenhill?" "Not today, and maybe not tomorrow," Adric said. "But relics like these don't stay hidden forever. The willow protected it for a long time, but the moment we removed it, the balance shifted. The world has a way of sensing things like this." Orlen sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You make it sound like the stone has a will of its own." "Perhaps it does," Adric replied. "Or perhaps it's just a catalyst, something that draws the will of others to it. Either way, we can't risk it falling into the wrong hands." The decision to leave Greenhill Vale was not an easy one. Orlen had lived his entire life in the quiet village, tending his garden, sharing stories at the tavern, and taking comfort in the rhythms of the land. The thought of leaving it all behind felt like stepping into a story he wasn't sure he belonged in. But as he stood at the threshold of Mossburrow, his satchel packed with essentials and the stone carefully tucked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the choice had already been made for him. The ring and the stone carried a weight that was bigger than Greenhill Vale, and perhaps even bigger than him. Adric stood waiting at the edge of the garden, his own pack slung over one shoulder. "I sent word to a contact of mine in Renhold," he said. "If anyone can help us make sense of this, it's her." "Her?" Orlen asked, raising an eyebrow. Adric smirked. "Cyrana Frosthaven, a scholar of old lore and a collector of unusual things. She's a bit of a recluse, but if anyone knows what this ring is, it's her." Orlen nodded, though he couldn't help but feel uneasy at the thought of involving yet another person in the mystery. Still, the idea of answers, real answers, was enough to spur him forward. As they stepped onto the path leading east, Orlen turned back for one last look at Mossburrow. The sunlight bathed the hills in a warm glow, and the gentle hum of the creek filled the air. He wondered if he would see it again, and if so, whether he would return as the same man who had left it. Adric clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't look so glum, Orlen. This is the beginning of an adventure. That's what you always wanted, isn't it?" Orlen chuckled despite himself. "Not quite like this." The two figures disappeared down the winding path, their conversation fading into the distance. From the shadowed tree line, a figure emerged cloaked in brown and green that blended seamlessly with the foliage. The figure knelt where the willow's roots still bore the faint glow of the hollow beneath, running a gloved hand over the disturbed earth. In the figure's other hand was a small token, a disc of dark metal, its edges etched with runes similar to those on the stone. The figure's movements were deliberate, almost reverent, as they placed the token against the roots of the willow. For a moment, the air seemed to shiver, and a faint whisper drifted on the wind, a language too old to be understood, yet undeniably alive. The figure rose, pulling their cloak tighter against the breeze. Without a word, they turned and disappeared into the woods, their purpose known only to themselves. The path eastward from Greenhill Vale was not often travelled, and as Orlen and Adric made their way across the hills, they quickly realised why. The road, once a well-trodden trade route, had grown narrow and uneven, with grass creeping over its edges and roots breaking through the packed earth. The cheerful scenery of the vale began to give way to sparser trees and rocky outcrops, the air growing cooler as they climbed toward the ridge that overlooked the eastern plains. Orlen adjusted the strap of his satchel and glanced over his shoulder, his gaze lingering on the distant outline of Greenhill Vale, now little more than a speck of green nestled among the hills. He felt a pang of homesickness, a quiet longing for the comfort of his burrow, the smell of baking bread, and the steady rhythm of his peaceful life. Adric walked ahead, his staff tapping rhythmically against the ground. He seemed far less troubled, his curiosity carrying him forward with purpose. "We're making good time," he called back, pausing to wait for Orlen. "If we keep this pace, we'll reach the crossroads by nightfall." Orlen caught up, frowning. "You're sure that's a good idea? That trader back at the fork didn't seem too keen on the place." Adric shrugged, his tone dismissive. "He's probably heard too many stories. Inns like the crossroads get their fair share of tall tales. Ghosts in the rafters, spirits by the well. It's all meant to keep people entertained by the fire." "Maybe," Orlen said, though he couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him since the trader's warning. The man had been gaunt and hollow-eyed, dressed in a tattered cloak that smelled faintly of damp wood. His warning had been cryptic but clear. The crossroads is no place for travellers. Not anymore. By midday, the path brought them to a wide clearing where a large oak tree stood at the centre. Its branches stretched high into the sky, casting dappled shadows over the road. Beneath its canopy sat a small wagon laden with jars of honey, bolts of cloth, and bundles of dried herbs. A trader stood nearby, his hands busy repairing a wheel with a set of well-worn tools. He looked up as Orlen and Adric approached, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Travellers?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Heading to Renhold," Adric replied, gesturing toward the eastern road. The trader straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "You'll be passing the crossroads inn, then?" Orlen hesitated. "We've heard it's not a welcoming place anymore." The trader snorted. "Welcoming? No, but shelter's shelter, and there's precious little else between here and Renhold. If you're going, best keep your wits about you. Folks say the woods around the inn have grown strange." "Strange how?" Adric asked. His curiosity piqued. The trader leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Shadows that move when they shouldn't. Voices in the night, and travellers who don't come back the way they came." Orlen's grip tightened on his satchel. "That doesn't sound like a place we want to stay." The trader shrugged. "Suit yourselves, but if the night catches you on the road, you'll wish for walls, haunted or not." The sun was low in the sky by the time they reached the fork where the road split in two. A weathered signpost stood at the junction, its wood cracked and leaning slightly to one side. One arrow pointed southeast, marked with the faint word Renhold. The other pointed east, toward the crossroads. Adric stopped, glancing between the two paths. "We could push on through the night," he said. "It's longer, but we'd avoid the inn." "And risk running into wolves, or worse," Orlen countered. He didn't like the idea of the crossroads any more than Adric did, but he knew that the woods could be treacherous after dark. Adric sighed. "You're right. Better to take the shorter path. At least we'll have a roof over our heads." Reluctantly, they turned onto the eastern road, the path narrowing as it wound its way through the thickening forest. The trees here were older, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out much of the fading light. The air grew cooler, and the faint sound of birdsong was replaced by an eerie stillness. As they walked, Orlen couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder more than once, but the path behind them was always empty. "You feel it too, don't you?" Adric asked, his voice low. Orlen nodded. "Something's not right here." "Keep moving," Adric had said. "The sooner we reach the inn, the better." The Crossroads Inn appeared out of the gloom like a relic of another time. Its walls were weathered and darkened with age, and its roof sagged under the weight of years. The windows were boarded up in places, and ivy crept along its stone foundation. A faded sign swung above the door, its chains creaking in the wind. Orlen hesitated at the threshold, his hand hovering over the iron handle. "Are we sure about this?" Adric gave him a wry smile. "It's not exactly inviting, but it'll do." Inside, the inn was dim and cold. The hearth at the far end of the room was dark, and the tables and chairs were covered in a fine layer of dust. Yet for all its abandonment, the air didn't carry the silence of an empty place. It felt expectant. Adric lit a small lantern, the flickering light casting long shadows across the room. "Well," he said, his voice echoing slightly, "at least it's dry." Orlen set down his satchel and began clearing a space at one of the tables. As he worked, his hand brushed against something cold and metallic. He lifted it carefully, revealing a small iron medallion etched with the same runes that had marked the stone and the willow. Adric's lantern light flickered, and the room seemed to darken slightly. From somewhere beyond the boarded-up windows came the faint sound of footsteps. "Did you hear that?" Orlen whispered. Adric nodded, his expression grim. "We're not alone." The flickering light of Adric's lantern threw distorted shadows onto the walls of the inn, stretching and shifting like restless spirits. Orlen tightened his grip on the iron medallion, its surface cold against his palm. The runes etched into the metal seemed to catch the light oddly, their grooves glinting faintly, as though alive. "What is this doing here?" Orlen muttered, his voice low but sharp. Adric stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the medallion. "Same markings as the stone," he said, his tone equal parts fascination and concern. "Whoever left this here knew about the relics, or perhaps even sought them out." The room fell silent again, save for the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet. Orlen placed the medallion carefully on the table, his fingers trembling slightly. "I don't like this," he admitted, his gaze darting to the boarded-up windows. "Something about this place feels wrong." Adric nodded, his brow furrowed. "It's more than just abandonment. It feels as though the inn itself is holding its breath." Orlen frowned but said nothing. He couldn't deny the sensation, the heavy stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. Even the air carried a strange weight, thick and cool despite the lack of any breeze. As they settled by the hearth, Adric worked quickly to light a small fire. The kindling sparked and crackled, casting warm light into the room, though it did little to ease the oppressive atmosphere. Orlen unpacked some bread and cheese from his satchel, trying to focus on the familiar comfort of a meal. "Let's just eat and rest," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "The sooner we're back on the road, the better." Adric nodded absently but seemed distracted, his gaze lingering on the medallion. He pulled out his notebook, jotting down notes and sketches by the firelight. "This inn wasn't abandoned by chance," he murmured. "Something drove people away, something tied to these symbols." Orlen didn't respond. His attention had drifted to the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker than they should have been. He blinked, straining his eyes, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, a faint, flickering shape shifting in the gloom. "Adric," he said quietly, his voice tense. Adric looked up, following Orlen's gaze. The corner appeared empty, but the unease in the room seemed to grow. Then, from beyond the boarded windows, a sound echoed through the inn, a slow, deliberate scrape, like nails dragging across wood. Both men froze. Orlen's heart pounded in his chest as the sound repeated, moving from one window to the next. Adric reached for his staff, his expression grim. "We're not alone," he whispered. Orlen nodded, gripping the hilt of his small belt knife. The scrape turned to soft thuds, as though something, or someone, was testing the boards covering the windows. The noise moved around the building, circling them before falling silent. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a sudden crash, the door to the inn rattled violently on its hinges. The door shuddered again, and this time the force splintered the frame. Orlen and Adric scrambled to their feet, backing toward the hearth as the air in the room seemed to grow colder. The door burst open and 3 figures stepped into the room. They were cloaked and hooded, their faces obscured, but their movements were unnaturally smooth, almost gliding across the floor. They made no sound, not even the creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. Adric raised his staff, the firelight glinting off its polished surface. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The figures didn't respond. Instead, they spread out, moving deliberately as though herding the two men toward the center of the room. One of them raised a hand and Orlen caught a glimpse of pale, skeletal fingers reaching toward the medallion on the table. "No, you don't," Adric growled, stepping between the figure and the table. With a swift motion, he swung his staff, striking the figure's arm. The blow connected, but the figure barely flinched, its hood turning toward Adric with an eerie stillness. The air grew colder still, and a faint whisper filled the room, a sound like wind moving through cracks in stone. Orlen's grip on his knife tightened as one of the figures turned toward him, its hollow presence pressing against his mind. The tension in the room reached a breaking point as Adric struck out again, this time knocking one of the figures backward. The cloaked being stumbled but didn't fall, its movements still silent and unearthly. Orlen, driven more by instinct than courage, lunged forward with his knife, slashing at the nearest figure. To his shock, the blade seemed to glance off the figure's cloak as though striking stone. The being turned toward him, its skeletal hand reaching for his chest. Orlen staggered back, his heart pounding, and his hand brushed against the ring hidden in Adric's satchel. The moment his fingers touched the metal, a surge of warmth shot through him, and the room filled with a blinding light. The figures recoiled, their cloaks fluttering as though caught in a sudden gale. The whispering sound grew louder, then faded abruptly as the figures retreated, disappearing into the shadows beyond the open door. Orlen collapsed to his knees, the ring still clutched in his trembling hand. Adric was at his side in an instant, his expression a mixture of relief and alarm. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice urgent. I don't know," Orlen stammered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I didn't mean to. It just happened." Adric helped him to his feet, his gaze shifting to the darkened doorway. "Whatever it was, it scared them off for now. But we can't stay here." As dawn broke, the two men gathered their belongings, their nerves still raw from the encounter. The medallion and the ring felt heavier than ever, their presence a constant reminder of the danger they faced. "We need to get to Renhold," Adric said as they stepped back onto the road. "And fast. Cyrana will know what to make of all this." Orlen nodded, though his thoughts lingered on the ring. The warmth he had felt, the surge of energy, had been both terrifying and oddly comforting, as though the artifact recognized him in some way. As they moved further from the inn, Orlen cast one last glance over his shoulder. The building stood silent in the morning light, its windows dark and empty. But somewhere in the woods, he thought he saw movement, just a flicker of shadow between the trees. He shuddered and quickened his pace, the path to Renhold feeling longer than ever. The gates of Renhold loomed ahead, their iron bars twisted into ornate patterns of vines and flowers. Though the town was far from grand, its walls and cobbled streets gave it an air of permanence and safety, a stark contrast to the haunting atmosphere of the Crossroads Inn. Orlen and Adric stepped through the gates just as the morning sun broke free of the hills, casting the town in warm light. Renhold was alive with activity. Merchants called out from their stalls, offering fresh produce, bolts of fabric and glittering trinkets. Children darted through the crowd, laughing as they played games along the cobblestone paths. Yet, despite the bustle, Orlen felt the weight of the ring and the stone pressing on his thoughts, a reminder that their journey was far from over. "We'll find Cyrana at the archive," Adric said, leading Orlen through the winding streets. "She rarely leaves the place, says it's where the past speaks clearest." Orlen raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly does she do?" Adric smirked. She calls herself a scholar, but she's more than that. Cyrana has spent her life chasing the remnants of the old world. Relics, stories, secrets. If anyone knows what these symbols mean, it's her. The archive stood at the edge of town, its stone walls draped with ivy and its tall windows streaked with dust. A brass plaque near the door read simply, Renhold Repository of Lore. Adric pushed open the heavy wooden door, and the two men stepped into the dimly lit interior. The scent of aged parchment and candle wax filled the air, and rows of shelves stretched toward the ceiling, packed with books, scrolls, and artifacts. At a desk near the center of the room sat a tall woman with dark hair pulled into a loose braid. She wore a cloak embroidered with runic patterns, and her sharp features gave her an air of authority. "Cyrana," Adric called out, his voice echoing softly in the quiet space. The woman looked up from the tome she was reading, her piercing grey eyes locking onto them. She rose gracefully, her cloak swirling around her. "Adric Thornbranch," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "It's been a long time, and you've brought company." "This is Orlen Mossroot," Adric said, gesturing to his companion. "We've come seeking answers, Cyrana. We found something unusual." Cyrana's gaze shifted to Orlen, lingering for a moment before she spoke. "Show me." They followed Cyrana to a small alcove lined with shelves holding strange objects, cracked masks, shards of pottery, and pieces of carved stone. A long wooden table sat in the center, illuminated by a cluster of flickering candles. Orlen set the stone and the medallion on the table, the flickering light catching the etched runes. Cyrana's expression remained calm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of interest. "Where did you find these?" she asked, her voice low. Adric quickly recounted the events at Greenhill Vale and the Crossroads Inn. Cyrana listened intently, her fingers brushing lightly over the carvings on the stone. "These symbols," she murmured, "belong to the keepers of the hidden paths. An ancient order, long vanished. Their purpose was to guard relics like this, relics that held the power to reshape the world." "Reshape the world?" Orlen repeated, his unease growing. Cyrana nodded. The keepers believed that the world was built on fragile foundations. These relics were created to protect those foundations, or in some cases, to destroy them. She picked up the medallion, holding it up to the light. "This is no ordinary artifact. It is part of a set, each piece tied to the others. Together they form a whole, an engine of immense power." Adric frowned. "And the ring? What does it do?" Cyrana hesitated, her expression unreadable. "That depends on who wields it. Such relics have no inherent will of their own, but they amplify the desires and intentions of those who carry them. In the wrong hands..." She let the thought hang in the air. Before they could ask more, a sudden crash echoed through the archive. Cyrana turned sharply, her hand instinctively going to the hilt of a short blade hidden beneath her cloak. "What was that?" Orlen whispered, his heart pounding. Cyrana didn't answer. She moved toward the main hall with swift, silent steps, Adric and Orlen following close behind. The room was dark now, the light from the windows blocked by a heavy shadow that seemed to seep into the air itself. In the doorway stood a figure cloaked in darkness, its form indistinct but radiating an unnatural cold. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the faint scent of damp earth filled the air. Cyrana stepped forward, her blade glinting in the dim light. "Who are you?" she demanded. "And what do you want here?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand and the air seemed to ripple, a low, resonant hum filling the room. Orlen staggered back, clutching the ring in his pocket as its warmth surged through him. "Orlen!" Adric shouted, grabbing his arm. "Don't let it—" The figure moved suddenly, its shadowy form surging forward like a wave. Cyrana met it head-on, her blade flashing as it struck out, but the force of the impact sent her stumbling back. Orlen felt the pull of the ring grow stronger, as though it was calling to him, urging him to act. He hesitated, torn between fear and instinct. "Orlen!" Adric's voice broke through the chaos. "We need to run, now!" The archive trembled around them, the faint vibrations of the crash echoing through its stone walls. Dust drifted from the rafters, catching the dim light of Cyrana's flickering lantern. Orlen clutched the ring in his pocket, its warmth pulsing faintly against his palm. Adric stood at his side, gripping his staff with a white-knuckled hand, while Cyrana peered into the shadows near the entryway, her sharp eyes scanning for movement. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice low and steady. "There's another way out." The three moved quickly through the narrow aisles of bookshelves, the weight of the air pressing against their backs as though urging them forward. Orlen glanced behind him, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from the doorway surging after them, but the hall remained still. Even so, the cold, unnatural sense of its presence lingered. "This way," Cyrana said, leading them toward a spiral staircase that descended into the lower levels of the archive. Her blade remained in her hand, its polished edge catching the faint glow of her lantern. "Where does this lead?" Adric asked, his tone both curious and wary. "To the catacombs," Cyrana replied, not slowing her pace. "They haven't been used in years, but there's a passage that opens into the lower part of the city." "Catacombs?" Orlen repeated, his unease growing. The thought of venturing into dark, forgotten tunnels beneath the ground wasn't comforting, but neither was staying to face whatever had entered the archive. They descended the staircase, their footsteps echoing in the narrow stone shaft. The air grew cooler with each step, and the scent of damp earth and old parchment gave way to something heavier, an ancient, musty odor that spoke of long-forgotten places. At the bottom of the stairs, Cyrana paused to catch her breath, holding the lantern high to illuminate the space. Rows of stone arches stretched into the darkness, their surfaces covered in faded carvings. Shelves of crumbling scrolls and empty alcoves hinted at the catacombs' original purpose, though the years had stripped much of it away. "This way," Cyrana said again, her voice echoing softly. She led them through the maze of arches and tunnels, each turn blurring into the next until Orlen lost track of where they had come from. He clutched his satchel tightly, the weight of the stone and the ring inside it a constant reminder of the danger they carried. Adric walked close beside him, his staff tapping softly against the stone floor. The silence of the catacombs was oppressive, broken only by their footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. Orlen's mind raced as they moved. "That thing," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was it?" Cyrana glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "A shadow," she said simply. "An echo of something that shouldn't exist anymore." "That's not an answer," Adric said, his tone sharper than usual. Cyrana's gaze hardened, though she didn't slow her pace. "If I had all the answers, I wouldn't be running from it." Orlen and Adric exchanged a glance but said nothing more. They continued through the labyrinth of tunnels, the light from Cyrana's lantern casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. At times, Orlen thought he heard faint whispers just beyond the edge of his hearing, but every time he stopped to listen, the sound vanished. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. "We're almost there," Cyrana said after what felt like hours. She stopped in front of a heavy wooden door set into the stone wall, its surface reinforced with rusted iron bands. She placed her hand against the door, her fingers brushing the faint outline of a carved symbol near the latch. The door groaned as she pushed it open, revealing a narrow tunnel sloping upward. "This will take us to the outer districts," she said, stepping inside. "From there, we can find shelter." As they entered the tunnel, the oppressive air of the catacombs began to lift, replaced by a faint breeze carrying the scents of the city above. Orlen let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, though his unease didn't fade entirely. "Do you think it followed us?" he asked, glancing back toward the darkened passages behind them. "If it did, we'll know soon enough," Cyrana replied, her voice grim. They moved quickly through the upward-sloping tunnel, the sound of the city growing louder with each step. At last they emerged into a narrow alley between two stone buildings, the sky above them dark and star-strewn. The bustle of Renhold's evening market echoed faintly from the main street nearby, a strange contrast to the silence they had just left behind. Cyrana extinguished the lantern and turned to face them. "We'll find a safe house in the lower quarter," she said. "There's much to discuss, and we need to plan our next move." Orlen nodded, though the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on his mind. The catacombs might have been behind them, but the shadow that had driven them there felt far from gone. The streets of Renhold were alive with sound and movement as Orlen, Adric, and Cyrana emerged from the alley. Lanterns flickered in the cool evening air, their light reflecting off cobblestone streets wet from a recent rain. Vendors called out from market stalls, their voices blending with the chatter of townsfolk and the occasional clatter of hooves against stone. To Orlen, the city felt overwhelming, its bustle a stark contrast to the quiet familiarity of Greenhill Vale. He kept close to Adric and Cyrana as they made their way through the winding streets, their footsteps quick but unhurried. "We'll go to the safe house," Cyrana said in a low voice, her eyes scanning the crowd. "It's not far, but we need to stay alert." Orlen nodded, his gaze darting nervously to the shadows between the buildings. The memory of the shadowy figure in the archive lingered in his mind, its cold presence still fresh. "Do you think it's still following us?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the noise of the market. Cyrana didn't answer immediately. She led them down a narrow side street, where the sounds of the market began to fade. "I don't know," she admitted finally, "but it would be foolish to assume we're safe." Adric frowned, his grip tightening on his staff. "What exactly are we dealing with, Cyrana? That thing, it wasn't just some wandering spirit." Cyrana glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "No, it wasn't. Shadows like that are tied to the relics, drawn to their power, or perhaps bound to protect it. Either way, we can't afford to linger." They turned another corner, the buildings around them growing older and more weathered. Cyrana stopped in front of a nondescript wooden door set into the side of a stone structure. She rapped on it twice, then paused before knocking once more. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. A tall man with sharp features and a wary expression stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the hilt of a dagger at his side. "Cyrana," he said, his voice cautious. "You're late." "And I'm not alone," Cyrana replied, stepping inside. The man's gaze shifted to Orlen and Adric, his eyes narrowing slightly before he stepped aside to let them in. The safe house was sparse but sturdy, its walls lined with shelves filled with books, maps, and various trinkets. A small fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. "This is Elias," Cyrana said, gesturing to the man who had let them in. "He's an old friend, and someone who can be trusted." Elias inclined his head slightly, though his expression remained guarded. "I hope you know what you're doing, bringing strangers here," he said. Cyrana gave him a pointed look. I wouldn't have come if it weren't necessary. She turned to Orlen and Adric. Sit. We have much to discuss. Orlen lowered himself onto a wooden bench near the fire, his satchel resting on his lap. The warmth of the flames was comforting, but the tension in the room was palpable. Cyrana pulled a chair closer to the hearth, her gaze fixed on Orlen. The ring and the stone. May I see them again? Orlen hesitated before nodding, carefully pulling the objects from his satchel and placing them on the table between them. The ring's dark metal surface glinted in the firelight, its etched runes faint but distinct. The stone, though unassuming at first glance, seemed to hum faintly as it rested beside the ring. Elias stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. "What are these?" he asked, his voice low. Cyrana didn't look up. "Relics," she said, simply done. "Tied to the keepers of the hidden paths." Elias's expression darkened. "The keepers? I thought they were just a myth." "They're not," Cyrana replied, "and these relics are proof of that, but their presence here raises questions. Dangerous ones." Adric leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "We need answers, Cyrana. What do these relics do? Why are they so important?" Cyrana sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of the stone. "The keepers created these relics to safeguard knowledge and power, things they believed were too dangerous to be left unguarded. The ring and the stone are part of a set, each piece tied to the others. Together they form a kind of key, a key to something ancient and hidden." "Hidden where?" Orlen asked, his voice tinged with unease. Cyrana shook her head. "That, I don't know, but the keepers were meticulous. If these relics have surfaced myth, it means their secrets are no longer secure." Elias crossed his arms, his expression grim. "And you think that shadow from the archive was after these?" Cyrana nodded. "It's possible. Shadows like that are remnants, fragments of something older, bound to the relics in ways we don't fully understand. They're drawn to their power, and they don't stop until they've claimed it." The room fell silent, the weight of Cyrana's words settling over them. Orlen stared at the ring and the stone, their faint glow reflecting in his eyes. "What do we do now?" he asked quietly. Cyrana leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. "For now, we stay hidden. We'll need to move soon, but first, I need time to study these relics. If we're to understand what we're dealing with, we can't afford to rush." Adric nodded, though his expression remained tense. "And if the shadow finds us here?" Cyrana's eyes hardened. "Then we'll be ready." The hours passed in tense silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the safe house. Orlen sat by the hearth, his thoughts a tangled web of unease and questions. Across the room, Cyrana worked quietly at a small desk, her fingers brushing over the ring and stone as she compared them to a series of old, worn texts. Adric leaned against the wall, his staff resting beside him, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space for any sign of movement. Elias moved through the room with practiced precision, checking the locks on the doors and windows, his expression unreadable. "The relics hold more power than I realized," Cyrana said finally, her voice breaking the stillness. She turned to face the others, her face pale but resolute. "This ring isn't just part of a key. It's a catalyst. It amplifies the will and intent of its wielder for good or ill." Orlen frowned, the weight of the ring's potential pressing down on him. "What does that mean for us?" he asked quietly. Cyrana hesitated, her gaze fixed on the objects before her. "It means we're in more danger than I thought. If the shadow is drawn to the relics, then others will be too. The power they represent is too great to ignore." Adric pushed off the wall, his expression grim. Then we can't stay here. If we're being hunted, it's only a matter of time before this safe house becomes a trap. Elias nodded in agreement, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. He's right. Renhold is no longer safe, especially if word of these relics spreads. Cyrana sighed, her fingers tracing the edges of the ring. Leaving won't be easy. The shadow's presence complicates things. It can track the relics, maybe even sense them from a distance. We'll need to move carefully. Orlen shifted uneasily in his seat, his hand brushing against the satchel at his side. The stone and the ring felt heavier now, their presence a constant reminder of the burden they carried. Where would we even go? He asked. If the shadow can follow us, is anywhere truly safe? Cyrana met his gaze, her expression firm. There are places the shadow cannot reach, ancient places hidden by the keepers. If we can find one, we might have a chance to learn more without interference. Elias crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. And how do you propose we find such a place? The keeper's secrets have been buried for centuries. Cyrana opened one of the books on the desk, its pages filled with faded maps and notes in a language Orlen couldn't read. I've been piecing together fragments of their network for years, she said. There's a location in the southern hills, a sanctuary, if the texts are accurate. It's our best chance. Adric frowned, his skepticism evident. And what if the texts are wrong? What if it's nothing more than ruins? Cyrana's expression hardened. Then we'll adapt. But staying here isn't an option. A knock at the door shattered the conversation, the sound sharp and unexpected. Everyone froze, their eyes darting to the entrance. Elias moved swiftly, his dagger drawn as he pressed his ear to the wood. "Who's there?" he called, his voice low but commanding. No answer came. Only the faint sound of footsteps retreating into the night. Cyrana's hand tightened around the ring, her knuckles white. "It's here," she whispered. "The shadow." Orlen felt his heart pound in his chest as the air in the room grew colder, the faint scent of damp earth seeping through the cracks in the walls. Adric grabbed his staff, positioning himself near the door. If it's come for the relics, we can't let it have them. The fire in the hearth flickered violently, the flames dimming as a low, resonant hum filled the air. Orlen felt the ring grow warm in his pocket, its presence pulsing with an almost living energy. Cyrana moved to the center of the room, her blade glinting in the faint light. "We hold our ground," she said firmly. "This safe house was built to withstand intrusions. We use that to our advantage." Elias positioned himself near the back door, his movements deliberate and calm. "If it breaches the front, I'll cover the exit. Get the relics out of here if you must." The hum grew louder, the walls of the safe house trembling slightly. Orlen's breath quickened as a dark shape appeared outside the window, its form shifting and indistinct. The shadow was unlike anything he had ever seen, its presence radiating cold and malice. Cyrana raised her blade, her eyes locked on the figure. "Whatever happens, stay close," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. The door shuddered violently, the wood splintering under an unseen force. Adric stepped forward, his staff glowing faintly as he muttered something under his breath. A barrier of light appeared across the entrance, holding the shadow at bay. For now. Orlen clutched his satchel tightly, his mind racing. The ring's warmth seemed to seep into his very being, filling him with a strange mix of fear and resolve. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Cyrana glanced at him, her expression unyielding. "We fight." The soft glow of dawn crept over the edges of Renhold's rooftops as Orlen tightened the straps of his satchel, his fingers trembling slightly in the cool morning air. The events of the previous night clung to him like a shadow. Cyrana's warning about the relics, the shadow's relentless pursuit, and the harrowing hours in the safe house. He glanced toward Adric, who stood a few paces ahead, his staff planted firmly in the cobblestones as he scanned the horizon. Cyrana emerged from the doorway, her blade sheathed but her eyes sharp and alert. "We'll take the southern road," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. "The hills will offer cover, and the old paths should be clear enough for travel." Orlen adjusted his satchel and nodded, though his heart sank at the thought of leaving the relative safety of Renhold for the unknown wilderness. Adric gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Stick close, Orlen. We've made it this far. We can handle a bit of rough country." Orlen mustered a weak smile, though he couldn't shake the unease that gripped him. The trio slipped quietly out of the city, their footsteps muffled on the damp cobblestones. The southern gate was unguarded at this hour, its iron hinges groaning softly as they pushed through. Beyond lay a narrow dirt road that wound its way through rolling fields, the grass glistening with dew. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of wildflowers, a reminder of the peaceful lands they were leaving behind. For a time, they walked in silence, the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the path the only sound. Orlen found his gaze drawn to the horizon, where the hills rose like dark sentinels against the pale morning sky. "These hills," Orlen said, breaking the quiet, "are they part of the old lands Cyrana mentioned?" Cyrana nodded, her expression distant. The southern hills were once home to the keepers, or so the texts suggest. They were said to guard a sanctuary here, hidden deep within the land. Adric raised an eyebrow. "And you believe we'll find it?" Cyrana's gaze hardened. "I believe we have no choice but to try." As the sun climbed higher, the road grew rougher, its edges lined with thorny brambles and clusters of wild rosemary. The fields gave way to patches of dense woodland, the trees stretching their gnarled branches over the path as though sheltering it from prying eyes. Orlen couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet foreboding, as though the forest itself was aware of their presence. "These woods feel different," he said, glancing at Cyrana. "Almost like they're watching us." Cyrana gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "The southern lands are old, Orlen. They've seen more than you or I can imagine. It's said the keepers left their mark on the land, shaping it to protect what they held sacred." They pressed on, the light filtering through the trees growing dappled and uneven. By midday, they reached the base of the first hill, its slopes covered in thick undergrowth. Cyrana paused, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade as she scanned the terrain. "We'll take the ridge path," she said. "It's steeper, but it'll keep us hidden from the main road." Orlen groaned inwardly at the thought of climbing, but he followed without complaint. Adric, ever curious, began pointing out bits of flora along the way, clusters of bluebell flowers, patches of moss that shimmered faintly in the light. "Amazing what thrives out here," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "Even in the shadow of history, life finds a way." The climb was arduous, the uneven ground and thick roots forcing them to move slowly. Orlen's legs ached and his breath came in short gasps, but he pressed on, spurred by the determination in Cyrana's stride. At last they reached a plateau near the top, where a small clearing offered a brief reprieve. Cyrana unslung her pack and knelt to inspect the ground, her fingers brushing over a patch of stone etched with faint markings. "This is it," she murmured. "We're close." Orlen dropped his pack and leaned against a tree, grateful for the chance to rest. Adric crouched beside Cyrana, his eyes wide with curiosity. "What do these symbols mean?" he asked. Cyrana traced the carvings with her fingertip, her brow furrowed in concentration. "They're part of the Keeper's Code," she said. "A language of symbols used to mark their paths and sanctuaries. This one," she pointed to a spiral, "indicates protection. We're on the right track." The sound of rustling leaves snapped them to attention, their hands instinctively moving to their weapons. Orlen's heart pounded as the bushes at the edge of the clearing shook, and a figure emerged. For a moment, he feared it was the shadow from the safe house, but as the figure stepped into the light, he saw it was a man, his clothes ragged and his face drawn with exhaustion. "Please," the man said, his voice hoarse. "I mean no harm." Cyrana stepped forward cautiously, her blade still at her side. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone firm but not unkind. The man raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "My name is Calen," he said. "I've been wandering these hills, searching for something, but it seems I've found you instead." The man stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, his thin frame barely holding itself upright. Cyrana kept her blade low but ready, her sharp eyes studying his every movement. Adric stepped forward cautiously, his staff held loosely but at the ready, while Orlen hung back, his fingers hovering near the straps of his satchel. "I mean no harm," Calen repeated, his voice rasping as though it hadn't been used in days. "Please, I've been searching, wandering. I have no fight left in me." Cyrana lowered her blade slightly, though her stance remained firm. "Searching for what?" she asked, her tone calm but edged with suspicion. Calen hesitated, his sunken eyes darting between them. "The sanctuary," he said at last. "I've heard the whispers. It's here, in these hills. I was told it holds answers." Adric's brow furrowed and he glanced at Cyrana. "That doesn't sound like the kind of thing most travelers stumble across," he said quietly. Cyrana took a slow step forward. "Who sent you here, Calen? And how do you know of the sanctuary?" The man flinched slightly, as if the words stung him. "No one sent me," he said, his voice defensive but weary. "I followed the signs, the stories. They all pointed to this place. I thought I could find it before—" His voice trailed off, and he turned his gaze to the ground. Orlen couldn't help but feel a pang of pity for the man. He looked as though he hadn't eaten in days, his clothes little more than tattered rags clinging to a frail body. "Before what?" Cyrana pressed, her voice firmer now. Calen swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. "Before they did," he whispered. "The shadows." The word sent a chill through the clearing, and Orlen's grip on his satchel tightened instinctively. Cyrana's eyes narrowed, her blade rising slightly once more. "You've seen them?" she asked. Calen nodded, his face pale. "They've been hunting me," he said. "Every time I get close, they find me. I thought I could outrun them in these hills, but they always come back." Adric stepped closer to Cyrana, his voice low. "If he's telling the truth, the shadows might not be far behind." Cyrana didn't reply immediately, her eyes fixed on Calen. At last she sheathed her blade with a sharp click and motioned for the man to come forward. "If the shadows are following you, they'll follow us too," she said. "You'll come with us, for now, but if you're lying, know that you won't make it far." Calen nodded quickly, relief washing over his face. "Thank you," he murmured. They gave Calen a bit of water and bread, which he devoured hungrily, though his eyes remained darting and anxious. Once he had regained some strength, Cyrana led the group onward, following the faint markings etched into the stones and trees. The path grew narrower and more treacherous, winding its way through dense undergrowth and jagged rocks. Orlen found himself glancing over his shoulder often, half expecting to see the shifting form of the shadow trailing them. Each time the path remained empty, though the uneasy feeling in his chest refused to fade. As they climbed a steep ridge, the group paused to rest, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the hills. Calen sat apart from the others, his head bowed as he cradled a flask of water. Adric joined him, his curiosity outweighing his caution. "What exactly are you hoping to find in the sanctuary?" he asked. Calen didn't look up immediately, his fingers tightening around the flask. I don't know," he admitted. "I was told it held power, answers to things I didn't understand. All my life I've felt drawn to places like this, places where the air feels heavy, where the past lingers. But the shadows, they come for me whenever I get close. I thought if I could find the sanctuary, I could make them stop." Adric frowned. "The shadows don't just hunt anyone. They're tied to the relics, to the keeper's secrets. If they're after you, then you've stumbled into something far bigger than you realize." Calen looked up at him then, his eyes hollow but filled with a desperate hope. "And you? Why are you here?" Adric glanced toward Cyrana, who was crouched over another stone marker, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We're here for answers too," he said simply. "And if we find them, maybe we can help you as well." Their rest was short-lived. Cyrana called them back to the trail, her voice sharp. "We're close," she said, pointing to a faint outline in the distance. Orlen squinted, his breath catching as he saw it, a weathered archway, half buried in the hillside, its edges carved with intricate runes. "Is that it?" he asked. Cyrana nodded. "If the texts are correct, that's the entrance to the sanctuary." The group approached the archway cautiously, their footsteps silent on the moss-covered ground. The air grew cooler as they neared, the scent of damp stone and earth filling their lungs. Cyrana stopped just short of the entrance, her hand resting on the carved surface of the arch. "These runes," she said quietly, "they're warnings. The keepers didn't want this place disturbed." Orlen's stomach twisted at her words, but Adric stepped forward, his staff raised. "If the shadows are after us, this might be the only place we're safe," he said. Cyrana hesitated, her hand brushing against the hilt of her blade. "Then we'd best be ready," she said. Without another word, she stepped beneath the arch, disappearing into the darkness beyond. Orlen and Adric followed close behind, the faint glow of Cyrana's lantern illuminating the rough-hewn walls of a tunnel that sloped downward into the earth. Calen lingered at the entrance for a moment, his eyes wide with fear, before he took a shaky breath and stepped inside. As the light of the outside world faded behind them, Orlen couldn't help but feel that they were leaving more than just the hills behind. They were crossing into a place where the past still lived, waiting to be uncovered. The tunnel stretched endlessly into the earth, its walls carved from ancient stone that seemed to pulse faintly with an unseen energy. The air grew colder as they descended, carrying the scent of damp moss and something older, something that smelled of forgotten places and time-worn secrets. Orlen kept close to Cyrana's lantern, its flickering glow casting long shadows that danced on the walls. Behind him, Adric's staff tapped rhythmically against the stone floor, a steady sound that offered some comfort in the silence. Calen lagged at the back, his footsteps hesitant, as though each step was a battle against the fear that gripped him. The tunnel finally opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. Cyrana held the lantern high, revealing smooth stone walls adorned with carvings that shimmered faintly, their shapes shifting as the light moved. Spirals, arcs, and runes intertwined, telling a story that seemed just out of reach, like the whisper of a half-remembered dream. Orlen stepped forward, his eyes wide as he took in the sheer scale of the place. "What is this?" he breathed. Cyrana didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the carvings. "A place of memory," she said at last. "The keepers built these sanctuaries not just to hide, but to remember. These walls hold their stories, their warnings." Adric approached one of the carvings, his fingers brushing lightly over its surface. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice reverent, but also haunting, as if they knew something terrible was coming. Cyrana nodded, her expression grim. The keepers believed in preparation above all else. They left these sanctuaries for those who might come after them, but only those deemed worthy would find them. She turned to Calen, who stood frozen near the entrance, his face pale. "You've seen the shadows," she said. "What else do you know?" Calen hesitated, his eyes darting to the carvings. "They're looking for something," he whispered. "I don't know what, but it's tied to places like this. I've felt their pull, like a thread tugging at me, leading me here." Before Cyrana could respond, the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the chamber. Orlen turned sharply, his heart pounding as the sound grew louder. "What is that?" he asked, his voice tight. Cyrana raised her lantern, scanning the edges of the room. The light fell on a doorway set into the far wall, its frame carved with intricate symbols that glowed faintly. "It's coming from there," she said. Without waiting, she stepped toward the doorway, her movements purposeful but cautious. The passage beyond the doorway sloped downward again, the air growing colder still. The sound of water became a steady trickle, and soon they emerged into a smaller chamber where a shallow pool glistened under the lantern's light. The water was impossibly clear, its surface reflecting the carvings on the walls above. Cyrana knelt by the pool, her hand hovering over the water but not touching it. "This is the heart of the sanctuary," she said softly. "The keepers called it the mirror of memory." Orlen approached, his curiosity outweighing his unease. "Why is it called that?" Cyrana gestured for him to look closer. "See for yourself." Orlen leaned over the pool, his reflection staring back at him, but as he watched, the image began to shift. The surface rippled, and scenes unfolded, visions of Greenhill Vale, of the Crossroads Inn, of the shadow that had pursued them. He gasped, pulling back instinctively. "It shows—" He trailed off, unable to find the words. Cyrana nodded. "It shows what lies beneath. Your past, your fears, your truths. The keepers used it to test those who sought their knowledge." Adric knelt beside the pool, his gaze fixed on the water. "What do we do now?" he asked. Cyrana stood, her expression resolute. "We need to understand what the relics are telling us. This sanctuary holds more than memories. It holds answers, but the shadows won't wait forever. We have to move quickly." She turned to Calen, who lingered near the doorway, his face unreadable. "You've been drawn here for a reason. The mirror may show you what that is." Calen hesitated, his hands trembling. "What if I don't want to know?" he asked. Before Cyrana could answer, a low hum filled the air, the same ominous vibration they had heard in Renhold. The carvings on the walls began to glow brighter, their light pulsating like a heartbeat. "They've found us," Adric said, his voice tight. Cyrana drew her blade, her eyes scanning the room. "We're not trapped yet," she said, "but we have to act." Orlen felt the warmth of the ring in his pocket, its energy pulsing in time with the light on the walls. "What about the mirror?" he asked. "Does it hold anything that can help us?" Cyrana glanced at the pool, her jaw tightening. "It holds what we bring to it," she said. "But whatever we find, we'll need to face it, together." The hum grew louder and the faint sound of whispers filled the air. Shadows began to coalesce at the edges of the room, their forms shifting and fluid. Calen backed away, his eyes wide with terror. "I can't," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't face them." Adric placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone," he said, firmly. The first shadow lunged toward them, its form stretching unnaturally as it closed the distance. Cyrana stepped forward, her blade flashing as she struck out, the shadow recoiling with a screech. Orlen gripped the ring tightly, its warmth filling him with a strange mix of fear and determination. "What do we do?" he shouted. Cyrana didn't look back. "Hold the line," she said, "and trust the mirror. It's our only chance." As the battle raged around him, Orlen felt the pull of the mirror drawing him closer. The water shimmered, its surface reflecting the chaos of the room, but also something deeper, a light that pulsed in the depths, calling to him. Taking a shaky breath, he stepped forward, his reflection rippling as his hand touched the water. The faint glow of Cyrana's lantern barely pierced the thick darkness of the sanctuary's depths, casting flickering reflections on the rippling surface of the mirror of memory. Orlen felt the cold stone beneath his boots, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and ancient moss. The shadows at the edge of the chamber shifted unnervingly, their forms fluid and ungraspable, but his attention was drawn to the mirror, where his own face stared back at him, distorted and trembling with each ripple. Behind him, Adric stood steady, his staff glowing faintly with the soft blue light that seemed to resonate with the chamber's ancient carvings, while Cyrana's sharp gaze moved across the runes etched into the walls. "This place is alive," she muttered, her voice low but resolute. "The Keeper's power lingers here, but so does something darker, something watching." Orlen's heart raced as he glanced over his shoulder toward Calen, who stood frozen near the archway, his pale face barely visible in the dim light. "Why isn't it attacking?" Orlen whispered, his voice trembling. Cyrana turned, her blade resting lightly in her hand, her expression unreadable. "The sanctuary repels it," she said. "But not for long. If we don't act, this place will collapse under the weight of its presence." The chamber seemed to breathe, the walls pulsing faintly as though responding to Cyrana's words. The carvings that adorned the stone began to shimmer brighter, their intricate patterns weaving stories Orlen could not decipher. The walls seemed to whisper faintly, the words unintelligible yet heavy with meaning. He felt the ring in his pocket grow warm again, its steady pulse aligning with the energy in the room. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice tight. Cyrana stepped forward, her fingers brushing over the surface of the mirror. "This pool is a conduit," she said. "The keepers used it to unlock their secrets, to protect what was sacred. If we're to find answers, this is the key, but it demands something from us in return." Adric frowned, his staff's light dimming slightly. "What kind of something?" Cyrana didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the water. "The truth," she said. "It reveals what you hide, what you fear. It forces you to confront yourself before it will give anything in return." Orlen's stomach twisted, and he took a step back. And if we don't want to confront it? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Cyrana turned to him, her eyes piercing. Then we leave, and the shadows take everything we've worked for. A low hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the stone and sending ripples across the pool's surface. The carvings on the walls grew brighter, the symbols shifting as though alive, and the air grew colder. "It's deciding," Cyrana said, her voice almost a whisper. "It knows we're here." Orlen clenched his fists, his mind racing. He thought of Greenhill Vale, of his quiet burrow and the garden he had left behind. He thought of the stone that had started this journey, of the shadows that had pursued him across the land. And now, standing in the heart of the Keeper's sanctuary, he realized there was no turning back. "I'll go first," he said suddenly, his voice louder than he intended. Cyrana raised an eyebrow but stepped aside, motioning for him to approach the mirror. "Be prepared," she said. "It will show you what you need to see, not what you want to see." Orlen knelt by the edge of the pool, the water's surface trembling as his breath brushed over it. Slowly he reached out, his fingers grazing the cold liquid. The instant he made contact, the world around him shifted. The sanctuary faded away, replaced by a vivid vision of Greenhill Vale, but it was not as he remembered. The hills were barren, the trees lifeless, and the streams dried up. His home was there, but its windows were shattered, the door hanging loosely from its hinges. He stepped toward it, his chest tight with dread, and as he reached the threshold, a voice stopped him. "This is what remains," the voice said, deep and resonant, but not unkind. Orlen turned, but there was no one there, only the empty landscape stretching endlessly before him. "What does this mean?" he asked, his voice shaking. The voice echoed around him. "The past cannot protect you. The future depends on what you choose." As the vision shifted again, Orlen saw a figure standing in the distance, cloaked in shadow. It raised a hand, and suddenly the barren landscape began to collapse, the hills crumbling into ash and the streams flowing backward in unnatural spirals. "You carry more than you know," the voice continued. "You have the power to change what is to come, but only if you face it." Orlen felt the weight of the ring in his pocket grow heavier, its warmth pulsing like a second heartbeat. He stepped forward, his breath hitching as the figure in the distance turned to face him. It was himself, or something that bore his likeness. Suddenly the vision dissolved, and Orlen was back in the sanctuary, gasping for breath. Cyrana caught his arm, steadying him. "What did you see?" she asked. Orlen shook his head, unable to form the words. Something I don't understand," he managed at last. Before Cyrana could press further, the hum grew louder and the pool began to glow, its light filling the chamber. Adric and Calen stepped back, their faces pale as shadows began to stir once more at the edges of the room. Cyrana turned to the others, her voice firm. "The mirror has opened," she said. "It's time." The mirror's glow pulsed brighter, filling the chamber with an otherworldly light that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The carvings on the walls shimmered, their patterns weaving together like veins of light threading through the stone. Cyrana's eyes were fixed on the rippling surface of the pool, her blade resting in one hand as her other hovered above the water. Orlen stood nearby, his chest heaving as he recovered from the vision that had shaken him to his core. Adric moved closer, his staff glowing faintly, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. "What do we do now?" Adric asked, his voice quiet but steady. Cyrana didn't answer immediately, her gaze locked on the mirror. The sanctuary has accepted us, she said at last, but the mirror isn't finished. It's calling for more. Her eyes flicked to Calen, who stood trembling near the entrance to the chamber, his face pale and drawn. Calen, she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. You're next. Calen recoiled, his back pressing against the cold stone of the archway. I can't, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. You saw what it did to Orlen. I can't face that. Cyrana stepped toward him, her presence commanding. You've been drawn here, just like the rest of us. The shadows won't stop chasing you until you understand why. The mirror will show you the truth, whether you're ready or not. Calen's eyes darted to Orlen, silently pleading for a reprieve, but Orlen could only nod, his own fear still fresh. It's hard, Orlen said, his voice hoarse, but it's the only way forward. With visible effort, Calen pushed himself away from the wall and stepped toward the pool. His hands shook as he knelt at its edge, the glow of the water illuminating his gaunt features. Slowly he extended his hand, his fingers trembling as they touched the surface. The chamber grew deathly silent, the only sound the faint hum of the mirror as Calen's reflection began to shift. Orlen watched intently, his breath catching as the water rippled and swirled, pulling Calen into its depths, not physically, but in a way that made it seem as though he was sinking into another world. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Calen gasped, his body stiffening as his eyes glazed over. The rippling water reflected a scene that seemed to shimmer like heat rising from stone. It was a vast, desolate plain, its surface cracked and dry, stretching endlessly toward a blood-red horizon. In the center of the scene stood a massive stone pillar, its surface carved with the same glowing runes that adorned the sanctuary walls. Around the pillar swirled dark figures, their forms shifting and indistinct, their movements like smoke caught in a gale. The pillar of mourning, Cyrana murmured, her voice barely audible. Adric turned to her, his expression questioning. You've seen this before? Cyrana nodded, her eyes fixed on the reflection. It's one of the Keeper's oldest legends, a place where their greatest secrets were hidden, guarded by shadows born from their own fears. It was said to hold the truth of their downfall. In the vision, Calen approached the pillar, his steps hesitant. The shadows parted as he drew near, though their movements grew more frenzied, their shapes distorting into monstrous forms. The closer Calen came, the brighter the runes on the pillar glowed, until they shone like stars against the desolate landscape. As he reached out to touch the stone, the vision fractured, splintering into 1,000 fragments before dissolving entirely. Calen collapsed onto the floor of the sanctuary, his breath ragged and his body trembling. What did you see? Cyrana asked, her voice sharp but not unkind. Calen shook his head, his hands gripping the edge of the pool as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. I don't know, he whispered. It was emptiness, fear, and that pillar. It felt alive, like it was pulling me toward it. He looked up at Cyrana, his eyes filled with desperation. I don't want to go back there. Before anyone could respond, the chamber began to shake, the carvings on the walls glowing brighter with each passing moment. The shadows at the edges of the room grew bolder, their forms coalescing into something almost solid. Adric raised his staff, the light at its tip flaring as he stepped protectively in front of Orlen. They're coming, he said, his voice tense. Cyrana drew her blade, her stance low and ready. The mirror has awakened them, she said. It's given us what it can, but now we have to defend it. The shadows surged forward, their movements unnaturally fast and fluid. Cyrana met the first with a swift strike, her blade flashing in the light of the mirror. The creature recoiled, its form unraveling like smoke, but more took its place, their shapes twisting and writhing as they closed in. Adric thrust his staff forward, a burst of light erupting from its tip and forcing the shadows back. Orlen stumbled toward the mirror, his hand instinctively clutching the ring in his pocket. Its warmth grew intense, almost burning, as if it were urging him to act. "What do we do?" Orlen shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by the sound of the battle. Cyrana parried another attack, her blade slicing through a shadow as she answered. "The mirror gave us the path," she said. "The pillar of mourning, that's where we'll find the answers. We have to get out of here and find it before the shadows overwhelm us." Calen scrambled to his feet, his fear momentarily forgotten in the chaos. "There's a way out," he said, his voice frantic. "Another passage. It's marked by the same runes as the ones in my vision." Cyrana nodded, her movements swift and precise as she cut down another shadow. "Lead the way," she said. "We'll cover you." As Calen ran toward the far side of the chamber, the others followed, their movements coordinated despite the chaos. Orlen felt the weight of the ring pressing against his chest as they moved, its warmth pulsing in time with the glow of the mirror. The shadows closed in around them, their screeches echoing through the sanctuary, but the group pressed on, their steps resolute. Finally, they reached a narrow passage, its entrance carved with the same glowing runes that had appeared in the vision. Calen hesitated for only a moment before plunging into the darkness beyond. Cyrana and Adric followed, their weapons ready, while Orlen cast one last glance at the mirror. Its glow had dimmed, but its presence lingered, as though watching them leave. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the passage, the shadows at his heels. The narrow passage wound deeper into the earth, its walls smooth and cold, as if carved by hands long forgotten. The glowing runes etched into the stone pulsed faintly, their light guiding the group through the oppressive darkness. Orlen's breaths came in sharp gasps, his legs aching from the relentless pace, but the warmth of the ring in his pocket urged him forward. Behind him, Adric's staff cast a steady glow, its light illuminating Cyrana's determined expression and Calen's pale, sweat-slicked face. The shadows that had pursued them from the sanctuary seemed to falter at the threshold of the passage, their forms melting into the gloom, but the air remained heavy, charged with an uneasy tension. "This way leads us closer to the pillar," Cyrana said, her voice firm but low. "The sanctuary's power has held them at bay for now, but it won't last. We need to keep moving." Her gaze flicked to Calen, who stumbled slightly, his hand brushing the wall for balance. "Are you with us?" she asked sharply. Calen nodded, though his movements were sluggish, his eyes distant. "I'll manage," he muttered, his voice thin. Orlen glanced at him, concern flickering in his chest, but he said nothing. The passage opened into a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in darkness and its floor scattered with jagged rocks and ancient crumbling pillars. A cold wind swept through the space, carrying the scent of stone and distant water. In the center of the cavern stood a towering monolith, its surface carved with the same intricate runes that mark the sanctuary. The pillar of mourning loomed like a sentinel, its glow faint but steady, casting long shadows across the cavern. Orlen felt a chill run through him as he approached, the ring in his pocket pulsing in time with the light of the pillar. "This is it," Cyrana said, her voice almost reverent, "the heart of the Keeper's secrets." Adric stepped closer, his staff raised as he examined the carvings. "It's more than just a monument," he murmured. "It feels alive." Cyrana nodded. "The pillar is a nexus. The keepers built it to anchor their power, to preserve what they feared the world would lose, but it's also a test." Her eyes turned to Orlen. "The relics are the key to unlocking its secrets. The ring, the stone, they brought us here for a reason." Orlen hesitated, his hand hovering near his pocket. The ring's warmth was almost overwhelming now, a steady pulse that seemed to resonate with the pillar itself. "And what happens when we unlock it?" he asked, his voice trembling. Cyrana's expression was unreadable. "We find the truth," she said simply. As Orlen stepped toward the pillar, a deep hum filled the cavern, the sound vibrating through the air and the stone beneath their feet. The runes on the monolith began to glow brighter, their light spreading outward in intricate patterns that seemed to ripple like water. Orlen drew the ring from his pocket, its dark metal surface gleaming in the light, and held it aloft. The pillar responded immediately, its glow intensifying as a beam of light shot out, connecting the ring to the carvings. A voice echoed through the cavern, deep and resonant, but neither male nor female. "The Keeper's legacy lies here," it said, the words vibrating in Orlen's chest. "A truth hidden, a burden carried, a path forged anew." The light from the pillar spread outward, illuminating the cavern in brilliant detail. Figures began to take shape in the light, their forms ghostly but distinct. They were the keepers, tall, robed figures with solemn faces and eyes that seemed to pierce the veil of time. One of the figures stepped forward, its gaze fixed on Orlen. "You carry the relics of our making," it said, its voice layered with the weight of centuries. "And with them, you carry our burden. The world is unbalanced, fractured by time and greed. What you choose to do with this knowledge will shape what is to come." Orlen swallowed hard, his grip on the ring tightening. "I don't understand," he said. "Why me? I'm just a gardener from the Vale." The figure's expression softened, though its voice remained steady. "It is not who you were, but who you choose to become," it said. "The relics are not tools of power, but guides. They will lead you to what must be done, but the choices are yours alone." As the figure's words faded, the light of the pillar dimmed, and the ghostly forms began to dissolve. The cavern grew silent once more, but the weight of their presence lingered. Cyrana stepped forward, her eyes scanning the now dormant monolith. "The pillar has given us its message," she said. "The path ahead is ours to find." Before they could move, the air in the cavern shifted, growing colder and heavier. A deep rumble echoed from the passage behind them, and the shadows that had lingered at its edge began to surge forward, their forms more solid and menacing than before. "We're out of time," Adric said, his voice tight as he raised his staff. Cyrana drew her blade, her stance firm. "The path forward lies beyond the pillar," she said. "We have to move." As the group hurried toward an opening on the far side of the cavern, Orlen cast one last glance at the pillar. Its light had faded, but its presence felt stronger than ever, as though it were watching them leave. He felt the ring grow warm again, its pulse steady and reassuring, and he knew their journey was far from over. The passage on the far side of the cavern led upward, the air growing fresher with each step. When they finally emerged into the open air, the sky above was a deep, endless blue, the stars shimmering like diamonds scattered across velvet. The land stretched out before them, a vast expanse of rolling hills and dark forests, with mountains rising in the distance. Cyrana paused, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "This is only the beginning," she said. "The Keeper's secrets are scattered, and the shadows won't stop until they've claimed them all." Orlen took a deep breath, the weight of the ring in his pocket a constant reminder of the burden they now carried. "Then we keep moving," he said, his voice steady, one step at a time. As the group set off into the night, the faint hum of the pillar echoed in Orlen's mind, a quiet promise of the challenges and discoveries yet to come.